Most people, some people, will point to this, which is the Apple Magic Keyboard. Firstly, it's not magic, just to kind of get that out of the way, but it is an interesting alternative to a MacBook or a Chromebook or any other kind of laptop, really. I've been using this for 6 months now, and I've got lots of thoughts as usual. Welcome back to Mark Ellis Reviews. Thank you for tuning in, and if you've already subscribed, thanks very much. If you haven't, just click the subscribe button at the bottom and you'll never miss an episode. I've always been an iPad user. I was one of the few people who bought it to begin with back in 2010, and back then, no arguments. It was basically a great big iPhone and had very little reason to be in anyone's lives. These days, it's transformed into something far more interesting, and I genuinely use it for my business. At a guess, about 20% of what I do takes place on the iPad. The rest of it takes place on my iMac or my MacBook. Part of the reason for that is that I think the iPad feels cumbersome to use in certain situations, and that's more down to iPadOS than it is the device itself, really. File management, using certain apps, using certain web-based apps, just feels a bit cumbersome at times. And while this Magic Keyboard doesn't fix those issues, it does make a more compelling case for using this more regularly. So let's get straight into it. Let's find out what I like about the Magic Keyboard, what I don't like about it, and more importantly, whether I'd recommend it. So I thought I'd start by giving you a bit of an insight into how I use the iPad in my day-to-day business life. The key task I use the iPad for is writing. I do a lot of blogging, a lot of content writing, and it's actually a great device for that when paired with the Magic Keyboard. I use it for email, web browsing, the standard stuff that you do with an iPad, really, media consumption. I also occasionally use it for some web apps. Even though I mentioned in the intro that it's a bit cumbersome, there are times when I need to use it because I might be out and about and it's the only thing I have to hand. I even use it occasionally to publish to my blog on WordPress, and it does a pretty good job, to be honest. But that's it. I don't go as far as using it for video editing or audio editing or anything more complicated, really. It's very much a get simple stuff done device for me. Now, I did for quite a while use the Apple Pencil with the iPad Pro, and I used it to take notes primarily. I've stopped doing that because I have now gone on to paper-based diaries and journals and note-taking, and that's, again, nothing against the Pencil or the iPad Pro itself. In fact, I think this is a brilliant option. You know, if you want to go digital with all of your note-taking, I'd absolutely recommend the Pencil and the iPad Pro. I just wanted to get back into these old-fashioned things, and that's the reason I did it. But you may still want to use that, but for me it's just a case of using the iPad for writing and doing very basic tasks. On the face of it, it just looks like a iPad case, like one of their folio cases, and it is. That's exactly what it does, but it does a lot more than that. Obviously, if you open it up, there's a keyboard in there, and that's not new. Apple have provided these kind of cases in the past, and there's lots of third-party options for it as well. Now, the way it works, once you've opened, you place your iPad on the back, it magnetizes, attaches to it, done, easy. You can then fold it down, it just becomes a case, nice rugged case for your iPad. Now, one thing to bear in mind, if you're used to the older iPad cases where you could fold them round, the keyboard cases, so basically you could take the keyboard and fold it around the back. You can't do that with this. This does not fold any further than that. So if you're the sort of person who likes to occasionally pick up their iPad, wander around the house with it, you can't really do it. You can do it, but you kind of have this thing sticking up, which that's caught me out a few times, if I'm honest. But it's just worth bearing that in mind. It's very much intended to be a keyboard case. That's its primary goal, I think, really. The other thing it has, which is quite nice, is this little charging port here for the USB-C cable. It just means that you don't have to have the USB-C cable hanging out the side of it. I think it does charge a little bit slower with this. I've never done any solid tests with it, but I get the impression it charges a little bit slower, so it's worth bearing that in mind. But yeah, that's a nice little addition. It makes the whole thing a bit tidier. So what do I like? I love the keyboard. As I mentioned in the intro, I do a lot of typing on my iPad, and it's just a great writing device. Keyboards are very subjective in terms of the quality, the feel, what people like. Some people like the great big old clicky keyboards. Some people are happy with even the old style MacBook Pro keyboard, which had a lot of criticism. This is somewhere in between. If you've got one of these Magic keyboards that comes with iMac, again, not actually Magic, but you'll be very familiar with the feel of the iPad Pro keyboard case, Magic Keyboard, it feels just very nice to type. There's a good amount of travel. The keys themselves are a good size. I don't think they're full size, but they're big enough. It's worth bearing in mind actually that this is the 12.9 inch version. I've not used the 11 inch, but on the 12.9 inch the keys are definitely nice and they just feel good, and it's just a nice sized keyboard. It also has backlit keys, which is a really useful thing. The other thing I'd like to quickly point out is the weight, which it got a lot of stick when it first came out for how heavy this keyboard case is. And again, this is the 12.9 inch, and I haven't tested the 11 inch because I don't have an 11 inch iPad. And yeah, when you get the keyboard case out of the box, it feels a bit heavy, surprisingly heavy possibly. But that's only really if you come from the previous generation keyboard cases from Apple, which aren't as heavy as this. And yes, it adds weight to the iPad itself, but it doesn't add so much weight that it's surprising. If I pick up my 16-inch MacBook Pro, for example, this is heavier. I'm not sure what you expect. You know, if you're going to add a keyboard case of this quality to it, to an iPad, it's going to weigh more. The weight hasn't bothered me at all. I carry it in my backpack, no issues. It also feels really well built. I mean, the hinge on this, you can't really experience this without actually picking one up, but the hinge is incredibly rugged. It gives you not a bad degree of viewing angles. I think it'd be nice if it went a little bit further back, I would say that. You can't quite use it sat on a desk with yourself standing up. It's a little bit too far forward. And the whole thing feels very well built. Like I say, I've had this for 6 months. I've put it through its paces. I do take care of my tech, but it does get thrown around as well. And it's looking pretty good. Yeah, it just feels like a very well built piece of kit. The other thing is, once you put your iPad in here, it feels like a totally different device. And a lot of that is down to iPad OS and the fact that it now supports the trackpad. And that's quite exciting. You know, if you're getting a bit bored of your iPad, for example, pick up one of these and yeah, it feels like something very different. The strength of the magnets needs special mention as well. Again, it's very difficult to demonstrate this on camera, but the way it kind of attaches to the back, it's very solid. I will do this. It does not come off. Trackpad's great in terms of responsiveness. I'll come on to the size of it in a moment, but yeah, in terms of how it feels as a trackpad, it's great, no problem with it whatsoever. Again, a lot of that comes down to the OS, which is in the way in which it deals with the cursor movement on the screen, but it feels great. You know, compared to my MacBook, it feels identical in terms of responsiveness. So what don't I like? Well, the case, although it's well made and feels like a very well made device, it does get dirty very easily. It picks up finger marks very quickly. There's lots of little, I don't know if you can see this on here, picks up blemishes quite quickly. There's a little bit of damage on mine in terms of just it's been scuffed, for example. I'm not a massive fan of the finish that Apple uses on these. They just, these keyboard cases do feel like they, I don't know, after a year, for example, this is going to look very different. I think it will still work, hopefully touch wood fine, but I think it will look very different. And if aesthetics are your thing, and it's weird saying this about Apple, just bear in mind that this case doesn't wear particularly well. I've also found that the screen isn't always that stable on certain surfaces. So if you're working on a table that isn't particularly flush or isn't particularly smooth itself, you might find that the iPad itself wobbles a bit. I found that you have to be on a pretty flat surface for it not to move. The trackpad does feel a bit cramped at times, I have to say. Although the responsiveness, like I said earlier, is great, it's small. Again, I'm coming from using a 16-inch MacBook Pro, which has a colossal trackpad. This is tiny by comparison, but it feels a bit too small sometimes. I quite often find myself hitting the top of it, or having to do very strange finger movements to kind of select text and stuff. But yeah, it feels a bit cramped at times. It's perfectly workable, but just bear that in mind. And also, in terms of being cramped, I occasionally hit the iPad, the bottom of the iPad, when I'm reaching for the top row of numbers. I guess that's probably why there's no function key row on there. There was a lot of talk about this when it first came out. People were a bit angry about the fact that you couldn't have that there wasn't a function key row on there. One, I'm not sure why you would have that. I suppose it would be handy for certain controls like brightness and volume, etc. But it's very clear when you start using this that there's no room for that. As I say, occasionally if I'm reaching for numbers on the top row, I do hit the iPad, which is just a bit annoying. It doesn't slow you down, but it can be a bit irritating at times. Also, the lack of escape key. Now, I know iPad OS doesn't support an escape key. You don't get an escape key on the on-screen keyboard. I get that totally. But when you put attach a keyboard to this, your brain just expects certain things, and because we're so used to having escape keys on normal keyboards, I do find myself occasionally perhaps trying to exit out of an application window, or exit out of a text field or something that would normally work on a Mac or on a PC, and it's not there. There's no escape key, so that takes a bit of retraining with your brain. Now, the other thing is the price. I can't avoid this. This 12.9-inch version of the Magic Keyboard cost me £349. That's an awful lot of money. The 11-inch is £299. It's a lot of money. I think if you add this to the cost of an iPad Pro, it really ramps up pretty quickly. Now, it is worth bearing in mind that this is compatible with the new iPad Air that's coming out soon, which I will review at some stage. That makes it a little bit more compelling, I think. But if you're going with the top-end iPad Pro, you can easily spend up to nearly £2,000, I think, if you add the Magic Keyboard in. So it's not cheap, and there are alternatives out there. So yeah, it's one of those devices which, from a business point of view, might be quite a simple purchase in terms of justifying it, claiming the VAT back, and looking at it as a investment in your business. If it's a personal device, if this was a personal device, for instance, for me, I'd have a hard time spending £350 on it. I don't think I could justify that. So the big question, would I recommend the Apple iPad Magic Keyboard? Yes and no. I know that's a bit of a sitting on the fence type thing, but let me explain. I've said this a few times, but I think it's worth reiterating. If this is for a business, if it's a business purchase, if you're a writer, or if you're someone who gets a lot of work done out on the road and you rely on your iPad, I'd get it. I think for £350 or £300 for the 11-inch, although it's expensive, it's a bit easy to justify if you're a business, if you're running a business, and you just won't have any issues with it. It will just work. So from a productivity point of view, compatibility and that kind of thing, it's a no-brainer. I think if you're a leisure customer, that's probably the wrong phrase, but if it's a device that you want to use for just hobbies and all that kind of stuff, I would look at the alternatives, and I'd also subscribe to this channel because I am going to do some tests with alternatives over the next 12 months. I just think it's too expensive. I think as great as it is, and as brilliantly compatible obviously it is with the iPad, and as simple as it is to use, and as well built it is, it's still a lot of money. And I think we live in times at the moment where people are certainly watching their pennies, and I would honestly seriously look at an alternative if you're just using the iPad for home use. However, if you are more of a laptop person and the iPad Pro just doesn't work for you in that respect, I recently did a long-term review of the 16-inch MacBook Pro. It's had some fantastic comments. Thank you if you've watched it already. If you haven't, carry on watching for a link to that video and enjoy. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.